In the winter of 1943, Thomas Archer, known to everyone as Tommy, worked as a humble but brilliant radio technician for the Royal Air Force at a top-secret signals unit on the quiet outskirts of Cambridge. He had once been an ordinary radio hobbyist who spent calm evenings tinkering with coils, solder, and homemade circuits in his parents' workshop. But war had changed everything. Now in uniform, surrounded by humming transmitters and glowing valve tubes, he worked long nights, calibrating primitive jamming equipment meant for the bomber crews who flew into the heart of danger. His hands were steady, but his heart carried a weight he could not speak aloud. His younger brother, Samuel, had been killed the previous year aboard a Lancaster bomber, brought down by a German night fighter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel had managed to radio one final warning before the plane exploded. A message soaked in static, fear, and the unmistakable sense that he knew he would never come home. That sound lived in Tommy's mind like a wound that refused to close. Every crackle he heard in his headphones reminded him of that helpless message, and because of that memory, he made a private vow that no other crew would be lost because their defenses were not good enough. He threw himself into his work as if he could bring Samuel back by saving others. Tommy's current assignment centered on a new airborne jammer codenamed Moon Whisper, a device intended to mimic and rebroadcast German radar echoes in order to mislead night fighter controllers. The project was overseen by Group Captain Darcy, a stern man with sharp eyes who followed rules the way a compass follows north. Darcy respected Tommy's skill, but he had no patience for Tommy's habit of proposing strange, unconventional ideas. Whenever Tommy offered one of his unpredictable suggestions, Darcy would sigh, rub his temple, and call it cute but stupid, a phrase that stung more than Tommy ever admitted. Still, Tommy kept studying, listening, learning. Night after night, he pored over intercepted German radar pulses captured by listening posts along the coast. He analyzed signals from Freya early warning stations and the narrower, more precise returns of the Würzburg fighter control systems. He learned their rhythms, their quirks, their hidden weaknesses. While other men slept, Tommy sat alone among the warm glow of vacuum tubes, feeling like he was trying to solve a puzzle whispered through fog. One frigid February evening, as frost gathered on the window edges and silence hung heavy in the room, Tommy noticed something unusual in a batch of intercepted radar data. Within the steady pulses of the German transmissions, there was a faint irregularity, a soft variation, barely noticeable unless one listened with absolute focus. To most operators, this tiny beat inside the static would have looked like random interference, the kind of noise that simply came with wartime radio work. But Tommy's instinct told him otherwise. The slight beat seemed intentional, or perhaps more accurately, exploitable. It was almost like a whisper, hidden between the pulses, a ghostly pattern, waiting for someone with patience to uncover its secret. Tommy leaned closer, headphones tight against his ears, and listened, as if Samuel himself was speaking. Driven by equal parts inspiration and desperation, Tommy grabbed his notebook and began sketching circuitry by hand. He imagined a feedback loop that could capture that subtle beat, amplify it, delay it just enough to distort the German pulse timing, and then send the altered signal back toward the enemy radar. The result, at least in theory, would be a false echo, a phantom aircraft, or even an entire phantom formation. The German operators would see shapes on their screens that were not real, shapes that could lure night fighters away from the real bomber stream. It was bold, untested, and, in Tommy's own honest words, dangerously reckless. But it could confuse the enemy enough to save lives. He stared at his sketch, fingers trembling with a mixture of fear and possibility, and whispered to himself that if this worked, Samuel's death might mean something larger than grief. Tommy called it his static trick, a name that made him smile in a tired, ironic way. The device was nothing elegant, nothing polished, certainly nothing that looked like it came from a government lab. It was simply an idea made of loops, wires, and hope. The next morning, during a technical meeting, Tommy presented his sketch with unsteady confidence. Darcy looked at it, then at Tommy, and erupted into a dismissive laugh. He declared that Tommy was proposing ridiculous noise, disguised as radar returns, and sneered that Tommy was basically spitting static at German radar installations. Others in the room chuckled, shaking their heads with patronizing amusement. No one took the idea seriously, and Tommy felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a sense that he had reached too far and made a fool of himself. But the idea refused to die in his mind. When the meeting ended, Tommy returned to the workshop with a stubborn determination that surprised even him. If they would not test his idea officially, he would experiment quietly. In the late hours, long after Darcy had gone home and the base lights dimmed, Tommy assembled a crude version of his feedback loop using scavenged parts and whatever spare valves he could justify borrowing. The device looked like something a child might have built with scrap metal and wishful thinking. Yet, when he powered it on and fed it a recording of the German radar pulses, the loop behaved exactly as he hoped. The beat inside the static grew clearer, then stretched, then mutated into something new. The feedback created a false timing echo, one that looked almost believable when tested against a simple scope display. It was not perfect, but it was something. Tommy knew he could not keep this a secret forever. He needed someone else with technical authority, someone who understood signals deeply enough to judge whether this crude experiment had value. He turned to Corporal Mary Lewis, a gifted cryptographer who specialized in signal analysis. Mary was sharp, patient, and far more open-minded than Darcy. When Tommy showed her the device and explained the concept, she listened without laughing. She asked thoughtful questions and requested to run real intercepted pulses through the loop. As the machine hummed, Mary watched the scope with widening eyes. The false signal blossomed like a tiny ghost on the screen, fragile but undeniably present. She looked at Tommy and whispered that he might have created something extraordinary. Mary helped refine the prototype, smoothing its timing irregularities and suggesting improvements to the amplification chain. She encouraged Tommy not to give up even when doubt gnawed at him. Her belief became the anchor that kept his resolve steady. She reminded him that innovation always looked foolish before it succeeded. Days later, Tommy and Mary arranged a small, unofficial test using a decommissioned Wellington bomber that served as a flying lab. Tommy insisted on flying aboard the aircraft as the radio operator, the only place where he could directly monitor the device's behavior. The plane lifted into the cold sky, engines vibrating through the fuselage. As the bomber reached altitude, Tommy activated the feedback loop. At first, nothing changed. Then, like a slow dawn, faint, false echoes appeared on the test radar station's scopes below. The operators believed for a brief moment that an unexpected formation was approaching. The illusion held just long enough to prove the concept. When the bomber landed, Tommy felt a thrill he had not felt since before Samuel died. The test had been small, imperfect, and unofficial, but real. It meant the static trick was not stupidity after all. It meant hope. And when Mary rushed to meet him on the runway, breathless and triumphant, Tommy realized that even one whispered beat in a field of static could change the course of war, if only someone dared to listen closely enough. In the weeks following the initial proof of concept, Thomas Archer, known as Tommy, began clandestine trials with a mixture of apprehension and fervor. By day, under the watchful eyes of Group Captain Darcy and the signals unit supervisors, he fine-tuned the loop circuits inside a spare jammer pod, making careful notes on every resistance, capacitor, and valve adjustment. By night, when the corridors of the base were quiet and the lamps dimmed to shadows, Tommy sneaked into a small, cobbled-together laboratory at the rear of the signals block, a space that smelled faintly of burning solder and oil, where he built a rogue set from scavenged radio valves, broken meters, and patched-together wiring. Each component was a relic in its own right: a cracked ceramic insulator from a discarded transmitter, a coil of copper wire nicked from a decommissioned wireless set, and an old galvanometer borrowed from a forgotten physics classroom. Tommy's hands moved with precision, his mind racing with calculations that balanced pulse timing, amplification, and the chaotic beauty of static. He had named this invention his static trick, a modest title for what he hoped would be revolutionary. Knowing the risks, he brought in Corporal Mary Lewis, whom he called Mayor, a cryptographer with a reputation for both brilliance and discretion. Mayer had earned Tommy's absolute trust, and together they pored over intercepted German radar echoes, comparing the patterns and trying to predict how the enemy would react if their signals were distorted. Mayer connected her equipment to Tommy's feedback device, feeding in streams of intercepted radar pulses captured from the Freya and Würzburg stations along the European coast. Together, they manipulated the loops, stretching and overlaying the pulses, introducing extra static in carefully calculated amounts, until the replayed echoes began to resemble phantom aircraft, distant formations that seemed plausible yet entirely fictitious. Each test required patience. Each adjustment carried the potential for failure. Tommy noted every anomaly. A spike here, a missed beat there, the way the signal strength fell off at certain frequencies. Mayer suggested subtle timing offsets that smoothed irregularities, and Tommy implemented them, watching as the fake echoes stabilized on her scope. The process was meticulous, requiring quiet hours of experimentation, calculations written in pencil margins, and careful observation under the soft glow of a single desk lamp. They discussed every detail, from the angle of antenna placement in the pod to the precise resistance values needed to keep the signal coherent, knowing that even the smallest miscalculation could render the device useless or, worse, expose them to scrutiny. Their first airborne test was scheduled with a decommissioned Wellington bomber converted into a flying laboratory for experimental jamming trials. The bomber's fuselage had been stripped of unnecessary weight, leaving only essential instrumentation, meters, transmitters, and a single operator's station for Tommy, who insisted on manning the device himself. Mayer remained on the ground, monitoring the radar returns from a mock RAF station designed for controlled experiments, one that mimicked the range and sensitivity of German night fighter radars. The aircraft climbed steadily to 10,000 feet, engines vibrating beneath the floor, carrying both fear and hope into the chill of early morning skies. Tommy checked the wiring, calibrated the loop again, and at the prearranged moment activated the static trick. A soft hiss emerged from the transmitter, barely audible over the drone of the engines, accompanied by the faintest crackle, the pulse that he had been chasing for months. On the ground, Moa's eyes widened as she watched her meters spike, and then she gasped when the scope of the test station revealed a cluster of blips where no aircraft actually flew. The simulated formation appeared suddenly, convincingly, each blip steady and believable. The operators, puzzled, called up their controller. "We see an incoming raid, but nothing visual. Confirm visual observation." Confusion and curiosity echoed through the radio. Mayer whispered into the phone, "It's working. The echoes are stable and the pattern is coherent." Inside the bomber, Tommy's heart thumped violently. A mix of exhilaration and dread. The thrill of success coursed through him, but fear lingered like a shadow. What if the real Luftwaffe radars did not respond the same way? What if this experiment backfired over enemy territory? What if he were discovered and court-martialed for reckless innovation? His fingers danced over the controls, adjusting gain and timing, watching the meters carefully. Mayer's voice crackled in his ear, steady and calm, reporting every subtle variation in the simulated returns. Tommy allowed himself a fleeting smile. For a brief moment, the long nights, the stolen hours, and the grief of Samuel's loss all coalesced into a sense of purpose. Here, in the hum of electronics and the thin air above England, he had created a weapon of deception, one that required no bullets, no bombs, only ingenuity and courage. After the flight, the bomber returned to base and the crew removed their headsets, faces flushed with cold and adrenaline. During the post-flight debrief, Darcy listened to the report with narrowed eyes. He was quiet for a long moment, then said flatly, "It's noise. Noise amplified and thrown out. Unreliable. Not suitable for operational use over hostile territory." His words were measured, but his tone carried skepticism and caution. Yet, he allowed a concession. It might be usable in limited cases, perhaps for training exercises or minor diversionary tactics, but it is not ready for prime time over the Reich. Darcy's critique was both a rebuke and a grudging acknowledgement. Tommy leaned forward, trying to contain both excitement and frustration. He argued that even limited use, applied during a single bombing raid with a few aircraft, could sow confusion across the German night fighter network. Mayer, standing by his side, supported every point with collected data, charts and graphs that showed the phantom echoes behaving consistently under multiple conditions. Their quiet persistence began to erode some of the doubt in the room, even among the most cautious officers. The evidence suggested that, while not perfect, the static trick could force enemy controllers to misallocate fighters, buying precious minutes and potentially saving hundreds of lives. Over the next several nights, Tommy and Mayer continued refining the device. They experimented with variations in pulse length, amplitude, and the introduction of subtle phase shifts to make the phantom echoes appear more convincing at longer ranges. Each adjustment was painstakingly recorded in a notebook that smelled of solder and ink, a document of both invention and hope. They faced frequent setbacks. Some loops produced distorted blips, others generated feedback that threatened to fry the delicate valves. Yet, each failure provided insight, guiding the next iteration. Tommy's obsession grew. He slept little, eating hastily prepared meals in the corner of the lab, thinking constantly about how a single misjudged beat could ruin months of work. Meray's steady presence reminded him to measure, to calculate, to observe, and to maintain perspective. Without her, the project might have collapsed under the weight of exhaustion and self-doubt. Soon, the static trick began to attract attention beyond their small circle. Signals officers, initially skeptical, were quietly intrigued by the potential. They visited the lab under pretext, peering at the bouncing scope traces and discussing theoretical applications. Tommy explained carefully, avoiding exaggerated claims but demonstrating consistent behavior in the loops and echoes. The evidence was compelling. Although Darcy remained cautious, he permitted a few more controlled airborne trials, this time over open countryside where radar stations had been set up to simulate enemy responses. Each successful test further confirmed the concept. The phantom echoes behaved predictably, the feedback loop produced believable targets, and the level of confusion it could introduce was significant. Word of the experiments circulated carefully, keeping the idea contained while slowly building a cadre of supporters who understood that the innovation, though unconventional, could be revolutionary if applied with discretion. By the end of the first month of trials, Tommy and Mayer had achieved a working prototype capable of transmitting multiple false echoes simultaneously, simulating a formation of bombers larger than any single flight could realistically include. The device was still bulky, temperamental, and required constant monitoring, but it demonstrated unmistakable promise. Murray recorded each trial meticulously, noting environmental factors, altitude, and frequency variations. Tommy, for the first time in months, allowed himself to imagine the impact this might have over the Reich. Confused night fighters chasing shadows, bomber streams arriving unscathed, lives saved, and perhaps a small measure of justice for Samuel. The static trick was no longer just a personal project. It was becoming a tool of war, a weapon not of steel and fire, but of sound, signal, and cunning. And so, in the quiet hours of the night, while frost glazed the windows of the signals block and distant lights flickered across Cambridge, Tommy and Mayer continued their vigil, listening, adjusting, and dreaming of the day when this whispered echo of ingenuity might ripple across enemy skies, turning a simple beat in static into an instrument of life, protection, and defiance. By the spring of 1944, the Royal Air Force had meticulously planned a major night bombing raid over the Ruhr industrial region, an operation deemed critical to disrupting German war production. Intelligence reports indicated heavy Nachtjäger activity, coordinated through a network of German Würzburg and Freya radar stations, each carefully monitoring Allied movements and relaying information to enemy night fighter squadrons. The higher command grew anxious as bomber losses mounted on previous raids, their standard jamming equipment failing to sufficiently confuse the enemy operators. Wooden crates of modified transmitters, spare wiring, and schematic manuals were piled in the hangars, a testament to the urgency and scale of preparation. Against this tense backdrop, Tommy Archer's static trick idea, long dismissed as eccentric, was finally approved. The approval, however, came with stringent limitations. Only 2 specially outfitted Lancasters, out of a force of 50, would carry his experimental feedback loop. Tommy was instructed that he would fly aboard one of the 2 test aircraft in the role of onboard radio operator, monitoring, tweaking, and recording the performance in real time. Mare, loyal and indispensable, was barred from the flight. She remained on the ground, her eyes trained on meters and oscilloscopes at the signals unit in Cambridge, connected via a secure remote link. The night of the raid arrived under a cold, starless sky, the moon hidden behind swathes of drifting clouds. The airfield was alive with activity. Crews hurried over engines, inspecting machine guns, checking bomb release mechanisms, and securing payloads, while the smell of aviation fuel mixed with the biting chill of the early spring wind. Tommy moved with a sense of purpose, balancing excitement and trepidation. He climbed into the radio compartment of the Lancaster, a space that smelled faintly of warmed metal and oil, where banks of dials, meters, and patch panels awaited him. He donned his headphones and began listening to the steady hum of the twin Merlin engines, the intermittent clicks of switches, and the quiet murmur of the crew passing along the fuselage. Every sound was magnified in the tension of the moment, each crackle in the wiring or static burst from the standard jammers sharpening his awareness. He checked the feedback loop one last time, tracing wires and valves, ensuring the circuit connections were secure and adjusting delay parameters for maximum effect. His hands moved over the controls with a practiced precision, born of countless nights in the small laboratory at the back of the signals block. But the stakes had never been higher. Outside the fuselage, the bomber stream assembled, 50 heavy aircraft climbing in formation toward the English Channel, their silhouettes barely visible against the dark sky. As the formation crossed the channel, the cold wind buffeting the aircraft and the engines vibrating beneath their feet, Tommy braced himself in the cramped radio compartment. His pulse was rapid, a drumbeat echoing in his ears, harmonizing with the low thrum of the bombers around him. Through his headphones, he caught every nuance: the hiss of the transmitter warming up, the occasional snap of static in the cables, and the nervous breathing of the crew moving past. Each footstep a reminder of the lives at stake. The first test over German-controlled airspace required delicacy. Tommy flicked the feedback loop on, cautiously increasing the gain and observing the meters. At first, nothing seemed to change. The hum remained constant, the pulses indistinct, the static merely a background murmur. He adjusted the delay, incrementally stretching the loops and amplifying the quiet beat within the radar echoes. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge, a coherent signal distinct from random interference, structured enough to suggest the presence of aircraft. Tommy's fingers danced over the dials, fine-tuning the amplitude, phase, and pulse repetition, aware that a single miscalculation could compromise the entire operation or alert the enemy to the deception. Far below, in the dimly lit laboratory at Cambridge, Mare monitored the meters with unwavering concentration. Each oscilloscope trace, each flicker of light, was scrutinized with meticulous care. When she observed the radar echoes on her screens beginning to coalesce into a believable formation, her voice cracked over the secure link, taut with urgency and excitement. "Tommy, they're seeing you." Radar returns lifting off their scopes, converging. The words pierced the radio static, and Tommy's pulse quickened. He whispered into the microphone, steadying himself. Hold steadier, now push the loop." He increased the feedback, layering static over structured echoes, sharpening the pulses. Below, across the German lines, night fighter controllers were momentarily thrown into confusion. Radar scopes displayed phantom aircraft formations, blips moving as though real bombers were streaming in from multiple directions, yet no visual confirmation existed. Reports crackled back to Luftwaffe controllers, shouting into their intercoms. "Incoming raid confirmed on radar. Direction unknown, range uncertain." The feedback signal jittered subtly, flickering in a way that mimicked real turbulence, further complicating enemy responses. Inside the Lancaster, the tension among the crew was tangible. One gunner, peering through the sight window, shouted over the intercom, "Flaks up ahead!" But the barrage was lighter than expected. German anti-aircraft batteries hesitated, uncertain where to concentrate fire, misled by the deceptive formation on their scopes. No night fighters appeared in their immediate sector. The bomber moved more smoothly than anticipated, gliding through the dark sky as Tommy maintained his concentration, adjusting the feedback loop to maximize the illusion. The technique was not without risk. The more he amplified the static, the more the electrical components strained, valves heating to near their operational limits, meters oscillating near maximum capacity. Each adjustment required a delicate balance between signal strength and equipment safety, all while maintaining an unbroken stream of coherent echoes. Mare continued her vigilant observation from Cambridge, interpreting every fluctuation, guiding Tommy with precision. Phase offset by 5 degrees, gain down slightly, a hold, now reinforce pulse. Her calm, authoritative voice anchored Tommy amidst the tension. The hours of joint work coalescing into flawless execution. As the Lancaster penetrated deeper into German-controlled airspace, the feedback loop maintained its deception, generating multiple false formations that appeared convincingly on enemy radar. Night fighter controllers, already anxious from previous raids, scrambled to intercept what they perceived as a larger, more complex attack. Pilots climbed and turned toward phantom blips, expending fuel and time, chasing non-existent bombers. Across the Ruhr, confusion rippled through radar stations, communications jammed by inaccurate readings, and the real bomber stream advanced with a reduced threat from enemy fighters. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. For nearly an hour, Tommy maintained the device, his senses stretched to the limit. The hum of electronics, the crackle of static, and the faint vibrations of the airframe blended into a symphony of precision and suspense. Occasionally, a minor anomaly appeared on the meters, prompting swift adjustments, a slight change in delay, a subtle tweak to phase, a minor realignment of the feedback loop. Each intervention preserved the illusion, sustaining the phantom formations across the German network. The real bombers, meanwhile, encountered significantly less resistance. Anti-aircraft fire remained sporadic, and enemy night fighters remained misdirected. The painstaking work of previous months, the stolen nights in the makeshift lab, and the countless hours of simulation and analysis had culminated in a tangible result. For the first time, Tommy's innovation was saving lives in real time, protecting crews from the deadly efficiency of the Luftwaffe's radar-guided defenses. Finally, as the Lancaster approached friendly airspace once more, Tommy carefully began shutting down the feedback loop. The hum and static gradually subsided, the meters returned to idle, and a profound sense of relief washed over him. His hands trembled from exertion and adrenaline, the culmination of fear and exhilaration leaving him momentarily weak. Mare's voice returned in his headphones, tight with excitement and barely restrained joy. "We fooled them. They believed in our ghost bombers." Tommy allowed himself a short private smile. In that fleeting moment, the long nights, the grief over Samuel, the doubts, and the trials seemed justified. The static trick had proven itself in the crucible of combat, demonstrating that ingenuity, courage, and determination could bend the course of war, even if only for a fleeting night. The Lancaster touched down on home soil, engines winding down, propellers slowing to a stop. Crew members disembarked quietly, weary but unharmed, unaware of the silent electronic deception that had kept them safe. Tommy, still seated in the radio compartment, allowed his mind to drift for a moment, thinking of the lives preserved, the crews that would return home, and the quiet victory achieved not with bombs but with sound, calculation, and a persistent whisper in the static. The success of the first raid reverberated through the halls of RAF command like a shockwave, subtle but unmistakable. Reports filtered in over telegraph lines, via couriered dispatches, and through secure telephone circuits, each one confirming what had been long hoped for. Tommy Archer's static trick worked in combat, saving lives and disrupting German radar operations. The initial experiment, confined to two specially outfitted Lancasters, quickly became the foundation for an expanded program. Within weeks, more bombers were outfitted with the experimental feedback loop jammers, each meticulously calibrated, each checked and double-checked for reliability and signal fidelity. Mayer, promoted to a key analyst at the Signals Intelligence Center, now played a critical role in the effort. She trained crews, demonstrated the operational procedures, and refined the circuitry to ensure the devices could be reliably operated in flight. Oscilloscopes, galvanometers, patch panels, and hastily labeled dials crowded the makeshift labs, and Mayer's notes filled binders with detailed schematics, instructions, and troubleshooting protocols. Her sharp mind and attention to detail ensured that what had once been a clandestine experimental procedure became a repeatable tactic, capable of integration into the broader bomber force. Over the next weeks, during a series of carefully planned night missions, the static trick was deployed repeatedly. The results were subtle, almost invisible at first, but cumulative. German radar operators, monitoring their Würzburg and Freya installations, began reporting unusual activity, formations that appeared briefly on their scopes, then vanished without trace. Controllers would scramble night fighters only for the aircraft to return without intercepting any real bombers. At long range, false returns, or bogies as the Luftwaffe operators referred to them, created uncertainty and hesitation. A particular radar station near Dortmund recorded no fewer than 7 false formations in a single night, sending its reports up the chain of command. Tommy monitored these operations closely from the ground, poring over incoming telemetry and debriefs, noting each anomaly, each discrepancy between German reports and the actual positions of Allied bombers. Maps were updated meticulously. Mare overlaid real bomber paths with recorded radar echoes, creating a visualization of how the feedback loops were manipulating the Reich's air defense network. Patterns emerged. The German controllers reacted predictably to the artificial blips, moving night fighters to wrong sectors, leaving the real bomber streams with reduced resistance. On multiple missions, Tommy noted that losses were significantly lower and bombing runs more complete. The payloads delivered precisely to their targets. Each success, while small in isolation, accumulated into a measurable strategic advantage. In the hangars, crews spoke of Tommy with a quiet reverence. To them, he was a genius who operated in shadows, a man whose innovations were invisible but deadly effective. Pilots would whisper about the ghost bombers, laughing softly at the thought that the enemy was chasing shadows while their own formation remained intact. One young navigator, barely 21, asked to see the experimental device, and Tommy demonstrated the small, valve-filled unit, its wires twisted and soldered with care, patched into the bomber's existing radio system. The device, unassuming and modest, seemed almost magical in its simplicity. Mayer explained the principle behind it, showing the loops and delays, how static could be shaped into a coherent signal that fooled the most advanced radar operators in Europe. Each illustration on the whiteboard, each chart plotted with painstaking care, revealed that the power of the trick was as much in the intelligence of its operator as in the engineering of its circuits. Meanwhile, within Berlin and other Luftwaffe headquarters, reports began surfacing that baffled even the most experienced radar technicians. Control room consoles, gleaming metal desks lined with dials, meters, and switches, were gripped by tense hands. Operators argued over anomalous readings, gesturing at flickering screens and scribbled logs. "Formation collapse at 10 kilometers, one officer exclaimed, bogies appearing on multiple channels then disappearing. Another countered, suggesting equipment drift, perhaps interference from atmospheric conditions. Some whispered of sabotage, conspiratorial tones threading their conversations. Yet, the patterns were persistent. The echoes were too coherent, too structured to be random, and they appeared across multiple installations, across multiple nights. The Reich's air defense network was experiencing a subtle, insidious manipulation, one that eroded confidence, even as it spared lives and disrupted operations. Reports crossed desks, signed in careful script, with annotations in red ink, highlighting the phantom formations that had inexplicably become a nightly occurrence. Memo after memo emphasized the mysterious nature of the signals, documenting ranges, azimuths, pulse characteristics, and the increasingly frequent inability to locate actual bomber streams. Tommy and Mayer continued to refine the system. Back in Cambridge, Mayer analyzed radar return traces using differential charts to overlay German reports with actual flight paths, noting where the feedback loops had successfully misdirected night fighters. She developed new metrics, quantifying deviations in radar operator behavior, measuring response times, and charting interception errors. Each night, new jamming devices were assembled, tested, and dispatched. Tommy personally oversaw the installation on selected bombers, verifying every connection, every solder joint, every vacuum valve. He was meticulous, aware that even a minor malfunction could betray the trick or endanger a crew. Meanwhile, Mayer's annotations were transmitted securely to squadron commanders, guiding them in the timing and operation of the jammers during flight. The coordination between ground analysis and airborne operation became a silent choreography, precise and intricate, almost imperceptible to anyone outside the narrow circle of technicians and operators. The effect of these measures rippled across the Reich. Luftwaffe radar operators grew wary, anxious, and uncertain. Multiple night fighter units, chasing phantom formations, were drawn into sectors where no bombers actually flew. Fuel expenditures increased, pilots grew fatigued, and commanders hesitated, unsure of the validity of the readings they received. In one instance, a fighter squadron near Cologne was vectored 3 times to intercept non-existent bombers, reporting back to headquarters each time that their target had vanished. By the 4th night, controllers were questioning their own equipment. Sabotage, technical failure, and human error were all debated in tightly secured rooms. Red pen annotations covered intelligence reports, highlighting ranges, pulse characteristics, and sudden disappearances, yet no explanation emerged. The Reich's defenses were destabilized, their response patterns increasingly erratic, all orchestrated invisibly by a quiet man and a brilliant cryptographer thousands of miles away. Group Captain Darcy, long skeptical but now convinced by accumulating data, convened a special conference. In a polished oak-paneled room, sunlight muted by drawn curtains, he addressed senior intelligence officers, squadron commanders, and technicians. Archer's innovation, Darcy began, his tone measured but resolute, has introduced a new variable into German operations. While the technique is effective, we must proceed cautiously. The enemy may in time detect patterns or adapt to our methods. He gestured to charts illustrating German radar responses, blips and lines annotated in fine script. If they understand the feedback loop, its power may diminish. Worse, they could attempt to reverse engineer it or use similar tactics against our forces. Tommy listened quietly, aware of the gravity in Darcy's voice. Though proud of the success, he shared the same concerns. Each deployment, each night mission offered both triumph and risk. Could the system sustain its advantage indefinitely? Could the German technicians, analyzing patterns of interference, eventually decode the method? The thought that the device might one day be turned against the Allies was sobering. Yet, he also knew that until such adaptation occurred, countless lives were being spared. As the weeks progressed, the static trick became embedded in RAF night operations. Additional bombers, both Lancasters and Halifaxes, were equipped with the feedback loops, and crews were trained to operate them efficiently. Murray's influence expanded, her lectures to officers and engineers emphasizing the subtlety of the method, the importance of timing, and the art of interpreting feedback loop behavior in flight. Manuals, handwritten and typed, circulated through the units, illustrating valve configurations, patching diagrams, and procedural checklists. Each schematic was accompanied by detailed notes on pulse amplitude, phase adjustment, and timing sequences, ensuring that even new operators could replicate the technique with a degree of reliability. Meanwhile, Tommy remained a quiet presence among the crews, often reviewing debriefs in dimly lit corners, noting anomalies and making incremental improvements. His focus was on precision, not recognition. He understood that the success of the operation depended less on fame than on consistency, accuracy, and the meticulous observation of both Allied and enemy behavior. The results were unmistakable. German night fighter responses grew erratic. Radar controllers argued over the validity of reports, while pilots complained of chasing shadows. One Luftwaffe squadron logged 15 intercepts over 5 consecutive nights that resulted in zero contact with actual bombers. Another reported phantom formations splitting mid-flight, confusing both controllers and pilots alike. Each deployment of Tommy's feedback loop, subtly but cumulatively, undermined confidence in the Reich's air defense network. Maps and charts circulated back to RAF command, demonstrating not only reduced bomber losses, but also more effective mission outcomes, with payloads hitting their intended targets more consistently. The manipulation of radar echoes, once an obscure experiment in a corner lab, had evolved into a strategic instrument, a silent, invisible hand shaping the course of aerial warfare. Yet, despite the success, both Tommy and Mayer were acutely aware of the fragility of their advantage. The technique depended on secrecy, precision, and the enemy's unawareness. One mistake, one pattern recognized, could nullify weeks of careful planning. The feedback loop was both a weapon and a potential liability. Tommy continued to refine the circuitry. Mayer analyzed new data, and together they maintained a constant dialogue with operational commanders, balancing innovation with caution. In their quiet moments, away from buzzing radios, crackling circuits, and the hum of oscilloscopes, they pondered the ethical weight of their actions. Each phantom formation, each misdirected fighter preserved life, but it also manipulated the perceptions and decisions of the enemy. It was a war of shadows, signals, and subtle deceit, one conducted in silence, yet with consequences felt across thousands of miles and countless lives. By the end of spring 1944, the RAF's night operations had been transformed. The Reich's radar defenses, once formidable, were now unreliable, susceptible to deception, and undermined by the ingenuity of two people who had mastered the invisible waves of electronic warfare. Tommy's name remained largely unknown outside his immediate circle, but among the crews and analysts, he was quietly revered. Mayer's influence, equally profound, ensured that the technique was both understood and repeatable, a cornerstone of operational planning. The static trick had moved from an experimental curiosity to a decisive instrument of strategy, rippling invisibly across the Reich, altering perceptions, and subtly shaping the course of the night bombing campaign. Each mission reinforced the lesson that war was as much a contest of intellect and ingenuity as it was of brute force. And in the quiet hum of feedback loops, static pulses, and radar echoes, two determined minds had found a way to bend the enemy's reality, one signal at a time. In the late summer of 1944, the tides of war were visibly shifting. The Allied push across France accelerated, and with each day, the Luftwaffe sensed its grip weakening. In response, they intensified night fighter operations, consolidating radar installations and rotating experienced controllers through key Würzburg and Freya stations. Among them was Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, a seasoned operator of 36, whose years behind the dials and meters had honed his instincts. He began noticing subtle inconsistencies in the radar echoes, the ghost returns that had long confused his colleagues. Where others dismissed them as random noise or technical drift, Richter grew suspicious. He demanded manual target confirmation before scrambling fighters, introducing additional layers of verification that slowed the Luftwaffe's response, but also hinted at an emerging understanding of Allied deception. On one critical night, a massive bombing raid targeting a synthetic fuel plant near Perlitz deep in the Reich, Tommy Archer's feedback loop devices were deployed across multiple Lancasters. Each bomber hummed with electricity, wires patched carefully into radios, valves glowing faintly like miniature stars. In the dim light of the compartments, Tommy Ain't himself rode aboard one of the Lancasters as the radio operator, monitoring the feedback loops and adjusting knobs with precise, careful movements. The bomber climbed steadily through clouds over the channel, the engine's roar a constant undercurrent, punctuated by the occasional distant crack of flak. Initially, the mission progressed smoothly. The static trick operated as designed, producing coherent phantom formations on German radar scopes, steering night fighters away from the real bombers and into sectors devoid of aircraft. Mayor Lewis, monitoring from Cambridge, tracked the progress on her oscilloscopes and charts, each blip and pulse relayed through a secure radio link. Her voice crackled through Tommy's headphones, calm and methodical, formation stable, echoes consistent, no deviations. But the night's fortune turned. Midway through the mission, on one Lancaster several miles ahead of Tommy's position, a feedback loop malfunctioned. The delay circuit jittered, the oscillations became unstable, and the amplified static threatened to overload the transmitter. The humming valves flickered, sending uneven pulses into the radio compartment. Tommy's pulse quickened as he adjusted the control knobs, fingers shaking slightly, sweat running down his brow, the roar of engines and distant artillery blending into a tense symphony of sound. The echo on the monitor split unpredictably, forming multiple returns that risked being interpreted as actual aircraft. Mayor's voice rose urgently over the radio. "Tommy, you're out of sync. The German controller is adjusting. He's reading you as three separate echoes. Cluster formation. He's vectoring fighters." For a moment, Tommy froze. The danger was immediate and real. If the Germans locked onto the irregular returns, they could intercept one of the Lancasters before it reached its target. The aircraft shuddered slightly in turbulence, and Tommy steadied his hands, aligning the loop, forcing a clean waveform. The soft hiss and crackle of the transmitter became steady, coherent, and the phantom formation coalesced into a single, believable cluster. Below, Mars meters confirmed it. The enemy Würzburg scope displayed one cohesive formation. Richter's fingers tightened over the manual confirmation keys. His operators hesitated. Confusion rippled through the control room. Controllers issued abort commands, voices tense. "Stand down." No visual. Returns vanishing. Inside the Lancaster, the gunner's warning lights remained dark. The tension eased incrementally, but did not vanish. Every crew member remained alert, eyes scanning the night sky, hands poised on triggers, hearts pounding. The bomber pressed forward through layers of darkness, over fields and rivers illuminated only by flashes of distant flak. When the target came into view, the crew released their payload with precision, bombs striking the synthetic fuel plant and detonating with a muted, controlled fury. Flames licked the night sky, and smoke plumes stretched toward the heavens, while below, German defenses scrambled to locate the source, misled by the coherent false formation orchestrated by Tommy's feedback loop. The return flight was tense but uneventful. Tommy, exhausted, monitored each echo, ensuring that no residual interference could betray the bomber's position. Upon landing at the English airfield, his face was pale, sweat soaking the collar of his uniform. Instruments were powered down, wires disconnected, valves cooled, and the crew began their tired descent from the aircraft. Mayor's voice crackled one final time through the secure link, trembling with relief and emotion. "Tommy, you did it. You saved them." The victory, however, was tempered by a lingering fear. The malfunction had demonstrated that every trick has its breaking point. A minor error or circuit failure could have catastrophic consequences. Darcy, standing over Tommy's shoulder in the dimly lit hangar, eyes grave, spoke quietly. "Every trick has its breaking point, Archer. Tonight proved it. Even brilliance has limits." Tommy nodded, aware that the fragile success of the feedback loop depended as much on precision, maintenance, and operator skill as on ingenuity. The experiment, once a theoretical innovation in Cambridge, had been tested under fire, revealing both its power and its vulnerability. Across the command centers and laboratories, technicians and analysts worked feverishly to understand the limitations revealed by the malfunction. Mayor compiled detailed logs plotting pulse deviations, delay inconsistencies, and the oscillation patterns that had threatened to betray the bombers. Each annotation in her binders represented hours of observation, calculation, and careful experimentation. New Protocols were drafted, introducing redundancies and fail-safes, ensuring that future missions could proceed without the same risk. Tommy, ever meticulous, assisted in the redesign, recalibrating valves, tightening soldered connections, and verifying the stability of delay circuits. The goal was to maintain the delicate balance between deception and safety, between operational success and potential disaster. By the end of the night, a weary calm settled over the airfield. The synthetic fuel plant had been struck. German radar operators had been confounded once again, and the bombers returned with fewer losses than expected. Yet, Tommy and Ma knew that the night had exposed the fragile edge of their advantage. The Reich was adapting, its operators growing wary and attentive. The oscillating boundaries of the feedback loop now tested under extreme conditions. Every mission, henceforth, would require vigilance, precision, and the relentless application of skill. As Tommy disassembled the device for inspection, valves cooling in the low light, Mare's hand hovered over a notebook filled with graphs, observations, and contingency plans. Their work was far from complete, the war was still raging, and the consequences of even a single failure could be deadly. That night, in the quiet hum of the laboratory, amidst oscilloscopes, dials, and patch panels, Tommy reflected on the thin line between triumph and disaster. The static trick, for all its brilliance, was a weapon of immense subtlety and danger. It had saved lives, misled the enemy, and demonstrated the power of ingenuity, yet it had also revealed the precariousness of relying on a single thread of technology in the vast machinery of war. Darcy's words echoed in his mind, even brilliance has limits. And, in that knowledge, Tommy understood the responsibility he bore. Every blip, every echo, every ghost formation could be a matter of life and death. After the war, in a quiet research facility, repurposed for peacetime, Tommy Archer sat in his old radio workshop, now lined with civilian radio sets, vintage valve gear, and shelves of amateur radio paraphernalia. His hair was graying at the temples, but his hands remained steady, moving confidently over dials and patch panels as if the years had not dulled his touch. Next to him sat Mare Lewis, now Dr. Mary Archer, a pioneering scientist in communications, her eyes bright behind wire-rimmed spectacles. They pored over declassified records, wartime after-action reports, RAF intelligence summaries, and translated Luftwaffe memos. Among them was the secret file on the feedback echo devices, what many in the Directorate had quietly called Archer's Loop. The documents detailed hundreds of odd reports from across the Reich, ghost formations, unexplained radar pings, misdirected fighter scramble orders. Tommy closed the folder, leaning back in a creaking wooden chair. They never knew how simple it was, he said softly. Mars smiled, tapping a notebook filled with diagrams and pulse charts. Sometimes the stupidest ideas are the most powerful, she replied. Outside, the radio mast on the roof stretched into the soft evening sky. Tommy could almost hear it, the crackle of static, the rhythm of pulses, the subtle feedback loop he had built. It was no longer a sound of war, but a whisper of peace, proof that even noise could protect lives. A small plaque on the wall read, "In memory of Samuel Archer and all who flew in the dark." Beneath it, a photograph of a young Lancaster crew, including his brother, smiling before a mission. Tommy switched off the transmitter, letting silence settle, though in his mind the echoes lingered, a quiet reminder that a single man, a loop of static and belief, had changed the sky. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.